It started with chest pain, tight and sudden like a fist clenching behind my ribs, and ended with me in the back of an ambulance, sirens wailing as the world blurred past the window. The hospital gown felt like paper, the air sterile and sharp. I remember trying to breathe through the fear, clutching my phone like a lifeline, dialing my son. He answered on the third ring, groggy, irritated. I told him where I was. He sighed, said he'd come by tomorrow, said he was busy. Busy! I laughed, bitter and breathless. In the end, it wasn't the heart that scared me. It was the sudden clarity. I was alone. Utterly alone. The nurses were kind, the doctors efficient, but no one came. Not that day, not the next. While I lay there recovering, doped on painkillers and saltine crackers, I didn't know that my front door was being pried open, that drawers were being rifled through, that my son, my only child, had used my emergency to stage his opportunity. He took the jewelry first, my late husband's watch, the pearl earrings I wore on my wedding day. Then came the safe. He knew the code, of course he did. Inside were documents, titles, deeds, everything I'd kept locked away for decades. And then the account information. I didn't find out until I was discharged a week later. My arms bruised, my body weak but determined to go home. The cab dropped me off at the curb. I unlocked the door, and immediately I knew. It wasn't just the mess. It was the absence. The empty spaces where things used to be. The silence of betrayal. I called the police, filed a report, but when they asked if I had any proof, if I was certain it was my son, I hesitated because some truths burn worse than lies. I checked the security camera. The footage was gone. Erased. I sat in my kitchen staring at the space where my husband's urn used to rest. Gone. And that's when the anger came. Not the hot kind. The cold, measured kind that sharpens over time. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I made a list of everything he'd taken and everything I was about to take back, because this wasn't just a robbery. This was a declaration that I was disposable, that my life was collateral damage. But he had underestimated one thing. I wasn't done yet. Not even close. I still had the house, the land, the pension. I still had power he didn't know how to touch, and I was going to use it not to punish him, but to rebuild what he thought he'd stolen, and then some. Because if he thought the hospital was the worst thing that would happen to me this year, he was wrong. That was the beginning of my recovery, of my reckoning, of a story he never saw coming. The first thing I did was see a lawyer, quietly, privately, no warnings and no tears, just paperwork and purpose. I explained everything from the missing items to the erased footage to the years of subtle manipulation I had mistaken for immaturity. The lawyer didn't flinch. He just nodded and said, "Then let's make sure he never gets to do it again." That sentence stayed with me, because for once, someone was treating my pain like it mattered, like it was valid, like I wasn't just a woman in a hospital bed or a mother mourning bad choices, but a person entitled to protection. We began the process of changing the deed, the pension beneficiaries, the living trust. Every dotted line that once had his name now had mine, or better yet, none. I moved my accounts. I opened new ones. I flagged old ones. And I did it all with a calm so deep it startled even me. My son hadn't returned any of my messages, not even the one that said, "We need to talk." I wasn't surprised. He was too busy enjoying the loot to wonder if the vault had been sealed shut, and I let him think it was. I let him think I was still the woman who once bailed him out of a car payment, who kept his name on the life insurance policy just in case. Because sometimes the best revenge is the one that doesn't announce itself. It waits, it watches, it prepares, and then it moves. I started selling the things he left behind. Old boxes, unused gadgets, even the gaming console I'd once saved up to gift him on his 21st birthday. Every object was weighed not in sentiment but in clarity. He had made it clear I was a resource to be mined. I was about to show him what it meant when that mine ran dry. Word got around in the family. Cousins started asking if I was okay. A neighbor offered to help repaint my front door. Even my ex-sister-in-law sent a pie, as if a dessert could undo a disaster. But what none of them understood was that I wasn't looking for pity. I was building momentum, and I was doing it alone. One morning I got a call from the bank. A transfer had been attempted, an old account, nearly empty, one I'd forgotten still existed. The name on the request was his, my son. Still trying, still scraping. I told the bank to freeze everything, close it, lock it down. And as I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Safety. It wasn't just financial. It was existential. The feeling that no one could reach into my life and rearrange it without my consent ever again. That weekend, I took myself out to dinner. Just me. A glass of wine, a rare steak, and a smile that didn't need explaining. Because I wasn't grieving anymore, I was redesigning. And there's nothing more dangerous than a woman who knows exactly what she's worth, especially after someone tried to take it all away. I didn't tell anyone about the letter I drafted. Not the lawyer who had helped me draw up the new will, not the bank manager who had flagged the unauthorized withdrawals, not even the neighbor who brought me soup on cold days and nodded like she understood grief in her bones. This letter wasn't evidence. It wasn't ammunition. It wasn't meant for a courtroom or even a mailbox. It was for me, a way to finally give form to the words that had haunted me at night, a confrontation I would never voice, a declaration carved into silence. I started it simply. To the son I once believed in. That line alone took my breath away. And then, like the slow break of a dam, the words rushed in. Not angry, but honest. I listed every small betrayal he assumed I'd forgotten. The birthdays he skipped with excuses too vague to challenge. The missed calls, the ignored messages, the way he rolled his eyes when I reminded him about things like flu shots or taxes or locking the doors. I wrote about the Christmas he left early, muttering something about real family obligations and how I smiled through it even as I washed dishes alone. I wrote about how he took my worry as weakness, how he treated my savings like an inheritance he was simply owed, and how he once said, half laughing, "You'll be fine, you've got stuff." Yes, I had stuff. I had the wedding album he never asked to see. I had the recipe box in my late husband's handwriting. I had a cedar chest filled with my grandmother's linens. I had silence, long, aching silence, and dignity I'd spent decades preserving. And now, I had something sharper. Not revenge, not spite, but resolve. I ended the letter with a sentence that came to me like a whisper in the dark. You didn't just rob a house. You tried to rob a legacy, but you forgot who built it. And then I folded the letter, took it outside, and burned it, not in anger, but in clarity. I didn't need him to read it. I didn't need him to understand. I needed myself to be free of the burden of explaining pain to someone who had never once asked what it cost to carry. That was the night I stopped waiting for closure and started building something else entirely. I had the house professionally reappraised, not because I wanted to sell it, but because I wanted to know its worth beyond what he imagined. I revised the will. I gave power of attorney to my friend Marla, who brought me tea when I was too tired to cook and never once asked for anything back. She wasn't family by blood, but she was family by choice. And in the end, that counted more. And then I started giving. Not to anyone who expected it, but to people who needed it. I donated anonymously to a shelter that helped women escape economic violence. I funded a scholarship at the community college where I used to clean bathrooms, on weekends to buy school shoes for my son. I named it the Second Wind Fund, because that's what I was living. My second wind, my second breath. A life that wasn't about what I'd lost, but what I was still capable of building. One afternoon at the post office, I overheard a woman talking to the clerk about her daughter being tricked out of an inheritance. Her voice was tight, embarrassed. I turned and said quietly, "They count on us staying silent." She looked at me, really looked, and nodded. There was no need for more words. In that moment, we both knew exactly what was meant. And that was when it struck me. The more I told the truth, the less shame it carried. The more I owned the story, the less weight it had on my chest. Betrayal can be isolating, yes, but it can also be connective tissue, a bridge, a spark. Because when we tell our stories out loud, something begins to mend, not just in ourselves, but in each other. That's the real legacy, not just survival, but the grace to rebuild, the courage to say, "I'm still here, and I'm not done." No matter how deep the break, there is something in a mother's core that refuses to stay. We adapt. We carve new names into old places. We write new endings with our own hands. We become something they never expected. Resilient, radiant, rising. And in the end, we're not just survivors, we're architects of new homes, new futures, and new names for what we call strength. The first time I saw him again, it wasn't planned. I was at the grocery store, pushing my cart through the produce aisle, comparing the price of lemons, when I heard his voice, casual, laughing. He was on the phone, one aisle over, and for a moment my body froze, the way it did the night I came home to the ransacked silence of my house. But then something remarkable happened. I didn't collapse, I didn't hide. I straightened my back, took a breath, and walked forward. He turned the corner and stopped mid-sentence when he saw me. The smile dropped from his face like a curtain falling after a bad play. "Mom," he said, like it was still a word that meant something. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at him. Really looked. At the expensive jacket, the watch I didn't recognize, the way he held himself like the world owed him softness, and I realized I didn't owe him anything. Not warmth, not a scene, not even a confrontation. I said, "I see you're doing well," and turned back to my cart. He followed. "Look, about what happened," he started. I stopped him with a look. "What you did wasn't a mistake," I said. "It was a decision, one that told me exactly where I stood in your life." His face flushed. "You're my mother, and you're a grown man who robbed a woman recovering from heart trauma." The words didn't rise in volume, but they landed with weight. He stammered. Said he didn't mean to hurt me, that he was desperate, that he thought I'd understand. I smiled. Not kindly. "You didn't ask, you assumed. You didn't reach out, you erased. And you didn't break in because you were desperate. You did it because you thought I wouldn't fight back." And then I walked away. I didn't wait for him to follow. I didn't check if he stayed. I paid for my lemons and left, because that's what healing sometimes looks like. Walking away when you're finally strong enough to stay standing. That evening, I sat by the window and wrote another list. Not of things I'd lost, but of what I'd reclaimed. Peace. Independence. A sense of self no longer tied to whether or not I was chosen by people who only showed up when they could take. I joined a support group that week. We met on Thursdays in the back of a bookstore, women of all ages and stories, sharing the moments that broke us and the decisions that rebuilt us. I spoke for the first time 2 weeks in, told them about the hospital, the theft, the fire it lit inside me. And one woman, probably 30 years younger, took my hand and said, "You just gave me permission." I didn't ask for what. I didn't need to. That's the thing about truth. It echoes, and once you let it out, it doesn't just free you, it finds others, wraps around them, lifts them. And that night, for the first time in months, I didn't dream about being robbed. I dreamed about planting a tree in soil I chose, in land I still owned, in a future I was designing for myself, by myself, rooted, real, unbreakable. By spring, something in me had shifted entirely. Not just the anger, not just the heartbreak, but the quiet, seismic sense that I was no longer waiting for anyone to do right by me. I had started moving my assets, reassigning beneficiaries, untangling decades of co-signed expectations that had once made me feel trapped and grateful at the same time. I met with an estate planner. She was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, soft-spoken, and when I told her the story, she didn't flinch. She just said, "Let's make sure your story ends with power, not pity." And together, we rewrote every line of my legacy. I transferred the house title into a trust, one with my name at the center and no room for loopholes. I revised my will to include only the people who had truly shown up, not because of blood, but because of presence. My neighbor June, who checked on me every day after the hospital, my goddaughter, who drove 3 hours with soup and laughter, even the woman from the bookstore group who stayed behind once just to say, "Your voice made me brave." They were the ones who earned a place. My son? I didn't erase him from the paperwork. I wrote him in deliberately for $1, a symbolic gesture, not out of cruelty but clarity, so that when the time came there would be no confusion, no revisionist history, just fact. And freedom. He wouldn't be able to contest it. Because I had receipts, and witnesses, and peace of mind I'd never had before. I also made a donation to the cardiology wing of the hospital that saved me. I used some of the recovered funds to buy medical equipment, and I asked them to name the recovery room after my late husband. Not because I believed in legacy through wealth, but because I believed in marking survival with gratitude. When they unveiled the plaque, I stood beside it and smiled. Not for the cameras, but for the woman I'd been in that bed. Alone, afraid, unseen. That woman deserved a witness, even if it came from the future version of herself. One morning, I walked through the house and realized it finally felt like mine. Not a museum of things my son had taken, but a living space of everything I'd reclaimed. I bought new frames. I painted the guest room a soft amber. I planted herbs in the windowsill. Every little change was a kind of punctuation, an ending to a sentence I'd let him write for too long. Now, it was my story again. I hosted a brunch in April, nothing fancy, just pancakes and sun and good company. I looked around at the table, at the women laughing, at the light spilling through the kitchen windows, and I thought, this is wealth. Not what's hoarded, but what's shared, what's built, what's protected. And in that moment, I knew that stripping him of the future he counted on wasn't vengeance. It was restoration of what mattered, of who mattered, of the truth that no one can steal what you choose to rise from. It was early June when I finally saw him again, my son, standing in the driveway like he had a right to be there, like time hadn't passed, like he hadn't gutted the home from the inside out while I lay in a hospital bed trying to stay alive. He wore sunglasses, but I knew those eyes. I knew that posture, the shoulders tilted just so, like the world still owed him something. I opened the door, slow and deliberate, and he had the audacity to smile. "Hey, Ma, thought we could talk." I leaned against the frame and said nothing. Let the silence stretch, let it press down. He shifted. "Look, I know you're mad. Things got complicated. But I was just trying to get ahead. You know how hard it is out there?" I kept my voice even. "You robbed me." He raised a hand like he could wave it off. "It wasn't like that. I mean, you weren't even using half that stuff." My throat tightened. But not with pain, with certainty. That stuff was your father's watch. My wedding pearls. It was trust. And you broke it. He sighed, like I was being unreasonable. Like he expected to be forgiven just for showing up. "You think you're the only one who's been through things," he said. "You don't know what it's like to be drowning in debt, to have nothing." I looked at him then, really looked, and realized he still didn't see it. He didn't see me, not the hours I worked, not the sacrifices I made, not the love I gave over and over without receipt. He saw a resource, a vault, a mother as an account to withdraw from. "I do know what it's like," I said finally, "to have nothing. I just didn't steal my way out of it." His jaw clenched. He said, "So what? You're cutting me out forever?" I nodded. "No, I already did. You just hadn't noticed yet." He stood there a moment longer, waiting for something. Pity, softness, a door that would crack open wider. But I didn't move, and eventually he turned and walked back to his car. No drama, no shouting, just the sound of his tires crunching gravel. And when the dust settled, I felt something like release, like freedom wearing new skin. Later that night, I poured myself a glass of wine and watched the sunset from the porch. It was fiery, unapologetic, unbothered. And I thought, that's how I want to live now. Not chasing closure, not reopening wounds, just steady, honest, untouchable. I posted a photo of that sunset with a caption that simply said, "Some doors don't need to be slammed, just closed, and locked, and left behind." The comments came in waves. People understood. They'd been there, and that made me feel less alone. Like maybe we weren't all broken, maybe we were just brave. Brave enough to know when to stop giving chances to people who treat love like an entitlement. Brave enough to write a new ending, one chapter at a time. The bank manager's face was polite but unreadable as she slid the folder across the desk toward me. "Are you sure you want to proceed with this?" she asked. "Once it's done, there's no reversing it." I nodded. "I'm sure." She typed something into her computer, and just like that, it began. The transfer of every remaining asset I had into a trust that bore one name only. Not my son's, not any relative's, mine. And beneath mine, a clause that detailed exactly where those assets would go should anything happen to me. Women's shelters, educational scholarships for single mothers, grants for elder care. Not a cent would pass through his hands again. The inheritance he had once been counting on, gone, rewritten, reclaimed. I walked out of that bank lighter than I'd felt in years. Not because I had more, but because I had taken back control. Of my future, of my legacy. I didn't need to announce it. I didn't need to rage online, I just needed to act. And I did. That same afternoon, I returned home and began cataloging everything, every item of sentimental value, every remaining possession with a story behind it. I made a digital archive, adding voice notes to each entry, not just for legal clarity, but because someday someone will want to know the meaning behind that chipped vase or that worn sweater, and I want them to hear it from me, my voice, my truth. Meanwhile, the podcast I'd guest starred on had sparked more attention than I expected. A journalist emailed me asking to do a feature not about theft, but about agency. What does it look like when a woman reclaims her name after a lifetime of being written over? She asked. I wrote back, it looks like a lock changed, a will revised, a life no longer offered on discount. When the article published, I received messages from strangers who said they'd been through the same. A woman in Maine whose daughter emptied her savings while she was in chemotherapy. A man in Arizona whose nephew forged his signature on a deed. Thank you for making me feel seen, one message read. But that wasn't what stayed with me. It was the woman who said, I thought I was weak for feeling hurt. You reminded me that pain is just proof we cared, and that healing is not weakness, it's war. I printed that message too, hung it next to the first. The wall above my desk was starting to look like a museum of resilience, and I loved it. It wasn't about glorifying the pain, it was about documenting the rising, a quiet kind of revolution, one built not from rage, but from resolve. And as the sun dipped behind the hill that night, casting long shadows across the porch, I whispered out loud, let him think I'm done. Because the truth was, I was just getting started, and this next chapter, it wouldn't be about what I'd lost. It would be about everything I was about to create. Spring came early that year, as if the world itself was eager for a reset, and for the first time in a long while, I let it in. I opened the windows, I aired out the closets, I planted marigolds along the fence line where the wind could find them. There was no dramatic finale to my son's betrayal, no courtroom showdown, no sudden apology, just distance, silence, a gap that grew wider with each passing month, and that was its own kind of justice. Because when people betray you and expect you to come crawling back, the greatest power is in not returning. I watched from afar as he moved into a dingy apartment, cycled through jobs he never kept, and floated in and out of social media with pictures that looked more filtered than real. There was no rage left in me, just a clarity that felt like breath. One afternoon I received a letter, handwritten, messy, no return address. It was from him. He said he hadn't meant to hurt me, that he thought I'd be fine, that he needed help. Not once did he say sorry, just that he needed. I folded the letter without reading the rest. I didn't need to. I had everything I needed. The power to choose, the power to close. I didn't reply. Instead, I went into the room where I kept my journals and pulled out the one labeled Reclamation. Inside, I added a new entry. Today, I said no. Not out of anger, out of peace. Because sometimes the strongest boundary is the one you never explain. That weekend, I hosted a dinner, not for family by blood, but family by choice. Neighbors who checked in during the hospital stay, a nurse who sent a handwritten get well card, a woman I met at the library who brought me homemade jam after reading my story online. We ate. We laughed. We told the truth. There was no pretending, no walking on eggshells, just presence. And in the middle of dessert, someone raised a glass and said, to starting over. I looked around that table and thought, this is what survival can look like. Not just getting through, but building better, stronger, wiser. I don't need an apology from my son. I don't need restitution, because what I created in the aftermath is worth more than anything he tried to take. I've changed my will. I've changed my locks, but more importantly, I've changed the story. It no longer ends with betrayal. It ends with me standing, thriving, whole. So if you're listening to this, if you've ever been taken for granted, robbed of more than just money, know this, the things they steal can be replaced. But the strength you find in rebuilding, that's yours forever. And no one, not even blood, can take that from you. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever found power in walking away or rising from what they thought would break you, share your story in the comments below. Let's remind each other that healing is the loudest comeback. And justice? Sometimes it wears quiet shoes, but it walks all the way home.